When one turns on a Nintendo 64 with the golden cartridge of its most critically acclaimed game pressed gently in their console, they are greeted not with bombast, but subtlety. On a moonlit night, the sound of hooves trotting in the distance, somber major 7th chords serenade the player as the moon sets, and the game's hero, Link, rides from right to left across the screen. The camera cuts to the ground, lifting up to catch the hero ascend a hill as the title card of the game fades into view, prompting the player to press start to continue. For over a minute, the solemn, unassuming music plays while the player is treated to images of Hyrule's curiosities until the player relents and enters the Save Select screen. This iconic opening cinematic tells you all you need to know about The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It's an emotional game set in a somewhat barren but certainly large world. It's delicate, understated, yet profound. While Ocarina of Time displays a wide emotional range, at its core, these dour notes flavor the entire experience. To play it, to understand it, is to marinate in these emotions and let them wash over you. Released on November 21st, 1998, Ocarina of Time is many things. An action-adventure experience, the 4th best-selling game on Nintendo's 5th best-selling home console, the highest-rated game of all time according to Metacritic, a herald of the future popularity of the open-world genre, and a swan song for series creator Shigeru Miyamoto, who still makes games, but has not since sat in the director's chair. Still, for all its accolades and storied histories, what Ocarina of Time means, why it matters, is better captured in a 1-minute cutscene and a Koji Kondo song than any facts we could regurgitate about its development and reception. This elaborate review is about that Zelda game. It's a quest to find meaning at the center of the game which sought to capture and control time itself, to explain what I took from it, and maybe what you took from it too. It's divided into 3 sections. In the first, codenamed Mayonnaise, we will examine the claim that Ocarina of Time is the best game of all time, or at the very least, among the greatest. We will approach this statement agnostically, and ask why we continually give this game the crown, and more importantly, why we keep asking the question. In the second section, juxtaposing the beginning of Link's journey with real life, we will explore what it meant to play Ocarina of Time upon release as an 8-year-old child, and why I'll associate the game with a particular time, place, and person for the rest of my life. Finally, in the third section, we pull the sword from the stone, and after 23 long years, I will finally beat Ocarina of Time and learn some potent truths in the process. In all honesty, this is probably my most weird and personal elaborate review. In spots, it's quite funny, in others, quite sad. I hope you enjoy it. Though, before we begin, perhaps you'd like a quest. You see, I release these videos for free, but they aren't free to make. The camera, the green screen, the lighting fixtures, and most crucially, the time are all paid with valuable rupees. I guess they're called dollars where you come from? You should give me some of these rupees in the form of a Patreon subscription. In return, you'll get your name in the credits of my videos, a vote on what I do in my weekly live streams, and a whole bunch more. Details in the link in the description. A special thank you to all my current patrons. Y'all are the best. Now, let's talk about the greatest game of all time. If any video game's reputation precedes it, that game is Ocarina of Time. Video game culture has been interested in elevating games above each other since someone looked at a TV screen and thought, hey, I bet I could put a sport on here. Many games lay claim to the crown.
If you head to everyone's favorite free encyclopedia, we find the list of games considered the best contains hundreds of items. It has all your favorites, including every game we will cover on this season of Elaborate Reviews. But no matter how much we all love Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe, Wave Race 64, or Mech Warrior 2 31st Century Combat, these are not the greatest game of all time. No, the greatest game of all time is, for better or worse, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Hey, don't shoot the messenger. It ain't my opinion, it's yours. Filtering by all games on all platforms, Ocarina of Time has the highest score of all games on Metacritic, a 99 out of a possible 100. IGN gave it their first 10 out of 10, and their readers named it the best game of all time in 2006 and 2008. Edge magazine named it the best video game ever in 2000 and 2009, while its readers took the hint and put it on top of their list in 2013. Nintendo Power labeled it the best Nintendo game on 3 separate occasions. Slant crowned it in 2014. Game Informer's readers said it in 1999, despite its spineless editors allowing Street Fighter Alpha 3 to beat it out for the top spot. That opinion doesn't look too good in hindsight, fam. That's like the 8th best Street Fighter game.
Sonic Boom!
FHM, which some freak in Britain reads on the toilet every Sunday, said it in 2010. The PAL Gaming Network, which I guess is Australian, said it in 2005. So we're kind of Mr. Worldwiding it here right now, aren't we? No one can even name drop Ocarina of Time in any pseudo-journalistic conversation without mentioning that they or other people consider it the best video game, or at least among such gods of the medium.
The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was released back in 1998 for the N64 and is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time.
Unanimously considered the greatest game of all time.
Ocarina of Time is the greatest game of them all.
Largely considered, both then and now, among the greatest video games ever created.
Is widely agreed to be one of the greatest video games ever produced. One of the most famous video games of all time.
A masterpiece of game design.
It's been regarded by many as one of the most perfect games of all time.
The most loved video game of all time.
The greatest game who ever lived!
One of the most influential games ever created.
It is still considered one of, if not the greatest game of all time.
So why should I be any different? As recently as April 2023, I labeled Ocarina of Time the top 11th game of all the games. You're watching episode 2 of a season of multi-hour personal documentaries investigating the best game I ever played at various points in my life. So if this ain't your first rodeo, you know what's coming. Ocarina of Time is the best game I ever played. Well, once upon a time. It was probably the best game you ever played once too, whether or not you want to admit it. Ocarina of Time represents a strange nexus point for this season, where public consensus and personal experience collide. So before we dive into my more atomized experiences with the game, traveling back in time to the near past of the late 90s and the distant past of March 2023, I want to dissect the conversation around the greatest game of all time. Because the truth is, we don't talk about the Nintendo 64's first Zelda game. Oh sure, endless ink has been spilled on it as much as any other game, but if you pay attention, whether to the Dunkies or the Scott the Wazes or the IGNs or the Edge magazines or the Liam Triforces or the Matthew Matosises or the King K's or the girlfriend reviews of the world, we are much more interested in talking about Ocarina of Time. We only bring it up when it's time to crown someone king. And any conversation of it must be prefaced with the phrase among the best video games ever, or something to that effect. Why did we collectively decide to enthrone this game? If we're so sure on the answer, why do we feel the need to keep asking the question? What do we, the gaming public, get out of it? I don't think Miyamoto or Nintendo cares, but hoo boy, you care. You dirty fans, it's all you want to talk about. It gives gaming websites their best, most evergreen SEO and their most active fan polls. It sells books and magazine covers. Even if, at the end of the day, it's the most transparently vapid discussion imaginable. When I ask why Ocarina, I am absolutely not interested in picking apart its game design, story, historical significance, or cultural impact. Other folks have done that well. Though, if you're looking for a better designed game, Portal's like $5 on Steam. If you want one with a better story, can I interest you in Return of the Obra Dinn? If you want a more historically important game, Doom is on Game Pass right now. As for cultural impact, someone wrote a hit song called Pac-Man Fever, for goodness sake. So, no. The answer to why is Ocarina of Time the de facto best game ever is not, at least purely, a consequence of what it is, but what it represents. After all, if we talk about talking about Ocarina more than we talk about it, we must be interested in what is in our heads rather than on paper. Though we can take one paragraph to assess Ocarina on paper, right? Okay, here we go. Ocarina of Time is a groundbreaking 3D action-adventure game, one which succeeds in virtually everything it attempts. The puzzles are thoughtful and play with the three-dimensional space well. The combat is simple but intuitive and fun. The story is well-paced and has a terrific central conceit. The presentation is a visual and acoustic delight, if monotonous at times. And most importantly, it just has that X factor. It feels important, self-assured, and confident in itself. It doesn't need a gimmick to draw you in. It never begs you to like it. It just expects you to. Something many of its successors, both literal and spiritual, struggle with. I wouldn't call Ocarina of Time a perfect video game, but who can deny its quality? Even accounting for its age, it's a classic. But it's not like classic, groundbreaking, confident, or even good automatically qualify a game for first place in the beauty pageant that is an IGN Readers Poll. Super Mario 64 is all those things. So is Final Fantasy VII. So is Resident Evil. So is Quake. And those are all just some of Ocarina's contemporaries. The question I'm getting at is simple. Is Ocarina of Time so much better than Half-Life, StarCraft, or Metal Gear Solid as to warrant its consistent placing above them all? Or does something else push us to place it at the top of the list? An obvious answer clawing to get our attention is nostalgia. Ocarina of Time targeted a rather wide age demographic, as anyone into games between the ages of 6 and 20 in 1998 was aware of its existence, and probably wanted to play it. As a big adventure game with a twinge of adult theming and the Zelda franchise branding, its impressive native attributes were amplified by the newness of its three-dimensional graphics. Ocarina was likely a formative experience for many gamers, so it makes sense, years post-release, that they might look back with rose-colored glasses and award it the title of Best Game. But I don't buy it. Ocarina of Time was crowned the best game of all time within months of its release. I mean, there was a 1999 poll in there, and the game came out in November 1998. I'm sure many an entrepreneurial spirit shouted it months before its release, based solely on screenshots in their Nintendo Power magazine. So no, I don't think nostalgia is the culprit. Maybe the franchise does the heavy lifting here. It's not too difficult to argue Zelda is the best video game franchise, and if Ocarina is the best Zelda game, then it's not too big of a leap to call it the best game and call it done, right? Again, I'm not so sure. While it's true the most popular games from the most popular franchises are most likely to win a popularity contest, that doesn't automatically tie up Ocarina of Time for the top prize. Zelda isn't everyone's favorite franchise, and Ocarina, anecdotally, seems to be no one's favorite Zelda game. Even in the most recent IGN poll, Link to the Past and Breath of the Wild placed above Ocarina. So at least according to that source, Ocarina of Time was never the best Zelda game, right? Because it had to be Link to the Past. In case you don't know, Link to the Past predates Ocarina of Time. Maybe Ocarina of Time is so gosh darn influential, it doesn't have to be the best game because every game that came after it borrowed from it. You know, I can kind of see this one. Ocarina of Time feels real and present in the way other 3D games like Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and Resident Evil can't quite pull off. In the age of relatively clunky cameras and controls, Ocarina of Time provided the template for a buttery smooth 3D experience, even if the game itself didn't hit that mark. But is it that influential? The Zelda series, to me at least, has always seemed to be more influential in spirit than in reality. A third of NES games could be labeled Super Mario Bros. Insert theme remix. Isn't that more influential? Grand Theft Auto 3 broke open the idea of the open world game, and we're still trying to put a cap on that Pandora's box 20 years later. Doom popularized the entire concept of a first-person shooter. These games are literally influential, historically significant market shakers that defined what came after them. Meanwhile, how many Zelda likes do we actually have? Not many. Designers may take bits and pieces of the Zelda formula and apply it to their games, but it seems pretty rare that they wholesale lift what makes Zelda unique, or even attempt to. For instance, Dark Souls is a game bandied about as an Ocarina of Time acolyte, at least to some. They both make liberal use of Z-targeting, have somber stories of loss and regret, and a big climactic boss battles. But Zelda is an action puzzle game. The vast majority of the time you progress with your wits, by pressing the brakes and contemplating what action you'll take next. Dark Souls, meanwhile, rarely tasks you with solving puzzles. You just gotta go places and kill things. Sometimes the killing of things is the puzzle, but it's not a prerequisite to the Dark Souls feeling. No item in Dark Souls is as critical as the hookshot or boomerang in Ocarina. No puzzle in Dark Souls will remind you of putting on the iron boots in the water temple. No narrative beat in Dark Souls is as intentionally gamified as the Gerudo Fortress. Nah, Ocarina of Time may be influential, but not in the way we usually categorize influence. Okay, you nervously shout, maybe Ocarina of Time doesn't have to be the most influential if it's pound for pound just the best game. Come on. You and I both know Ocarina of Time is good, but it's not more polished than any other games of its generation. It's a janky mess which relies a lot more on vibes than strictly good mechanics. It's easy to argue more love and care went into the design of Super Mario 64, a game with way more intentional design than Ocarina. We can love the jank, but we don't usually associate it with great games. So, what is it? Why do we incessantly crown Ocarina of Time as the greatest game of all time? Well, I have an unsatisfying, but nonetheless true answer for you. Ocarina of Time feels like that game. I mean, doesn't it? You pull a master sword from a stone, a talking tree gives you an epic quest where you're the destined hero, and the game doesn't do any of it ironically or even undermine its tropes. I'm not saying Ocarina of Time isn't funny, it often is, but it takes itself seriously. We don't hide in cardboard boxes, make Jill sandwiches, or compare the plot to pornographic films. Ocarina of Time plays it straight. It's a game where you have a forest, fire, and water level, and then immediately after, do another round of forest, fire, and water levels, in that order. And it never comments on how absurd and repetitive it is. It's a game that, outside of one unique plot twist in the center of the story, is literally just about a hero dude saving the kingdom from the villain dude with a princess dude who gives you the quest in the first place. Ocarina of Time is the mayonnaise of video games. Plain, fatty, boring, but oh so delicious. To draw a completely opposite comparison, earlier this year Square Enix released Forspoken. Forspoken was an unfortunate combination of developed by a big company, middling reviews, and kinda cringe. So it quickly became the bullying target of internet denizens wishing to take Joss Whedon down a peg, I guess? In particular, the Twitter discourse revolved around the self-referential nature of the game's dialogue and comedy, and how forced that all felt. Lines like, yeah, okay, hey, that's something I do now, are self-conscious ways of undercutting your own game. If you point out the absurdity of your plot, you beat the critics to the punch. But That move can often feel hollow, like you don't believe your game can make a meaningful connection with your audience. If you go looking, you'll find most games have some self-reflexive tendencies, but Ocarina of Time? No. It believes in itself too much. Staring at it too long, I get the impression that every other video game has warped itself around Ocarina of Time, particularly other action-adventure games. We judge them by how much they distance themselves from Ocarina Daddy. The effect is most potent in other mainline Zelda games because they all have gimmicks. It's like the kids from Succession all got together and tried to make their own video games. Wind Waker is a seafaring game, Majora's Mask is a time loop game, Twilight Princess is a Fursona game, Skyward Sword has motion controls. Structurally, each is a revised version of Ocarina of Time with some magic what-if powder thrown into the mixture. The magic powder makes them great. I personally like Majora's Mask and Wind Waker more than Ocarina of Time. But it's kind of impossible to argue they're better than their daddy when they try so hard to not be him in the first place. So many games suffer from what I'll call the magic powder curse. They're exciting and novel because of the magic powder, that essential new ingredient they offer the player, but the powder itself dates them. Not necessarily in a negative sense, or even in an age sense, but in a way that marks their distance from some progenitor. To be something new, you must do something new. But the act of doing something new places you at a time and space. It grounds you. To be considered the, quote, greatest game of all time, you need to break free of such chains, escape temporality. And that's why Ocarina of Time wins out. Ocarina of Time is not new. Ocarina of Time was never new. Yeah, of course, we can identify a specific day when it came out, but what's new about Ocarina of Time is not magic powder. No, because three-dimensional graphics, Z-targeting, powerful music, etc. are not distinct to it. Ocarina of Time is not unique. It has no discernible features we can point to as solely existing in this particular game. Everything new about Ocarina of Time either predates it, I mean, the previous game in the series was also about time travel, or succeeds it, since we're still getting 3D action Zelda games today. We're still playing games with fire and water temples. We're still pressing a button to lock onto enemies. Ocarina of Time has no magic powder. It's mayonnaise. Powerful, good, tasty, but still just good old mayonnaise. For my money, Ocarina of Time keeps winning the beauty pageant because it's not the one with ... It's just the one. In its blandness, we find its strength. You can find in Ocarina of Time anything you like about video games, and usually nothing, or at least not much, you don't like about video games, which might actually be the more important part of the equation. Because once you toss in some magic powder, you alienate some people. Those who, for whatever reason, don't like its taste. They don't want to do time loops. They don't want to be a wolf. They don't want to play with motion controls. Some people don't like ketchup. Some people don't like mustard. Some people think it's weird to put sriracha sauce on a hot dog. But Ocarina of Time has little to dislike because, well, it's mayonnaise. And most people like mayonnaise. Yet, figuring out why Ocarina of Time is perpetually among the best video games of all time does not tell us why we feel the need to keep bringing it up. After all, we'd still be having the greatest game of all time debate if Thanos snapped the Zelda franchise out of existence. So, even if Ocarina of Time was the conversation ender, it doesn't answer our need to have the conversation in the first place. Not to demean you gamers, but film heads, TV likers, and music hounds aren't nearly as obsessed with discerning the best of their respective art forms as often as games likers are. They may have year-end rewards, but no one thinks the Grammys or Oscars tell you the best movie from that given year. And sure, publications do come out with lists every once in a while, but the best ever conversation isn't a pervasive part of music culture. It is a pervasive part of video game culture. I suppose once upon a time, when games were relatively new, it might have felt like the list kept changing every year. Consider that in 1998, the year Ocarina of Time came out, was also the year of StarCraft, Metal Gear Solid, Half-Life, Resident Evil 2, Grim Fandango, and Thief. These games all have a chance to place on someone's favorite games list. So, maybe from the 90s through the early 2000s, games were moving so fast that the best games of all time really did need to be updated every 6 months to account for new releases. But that's probably my best argument, and it's not a good one. It's not normal to compare every new release against every game that ever came out before it. I'm not going to compare Nolan's new Oppenheimer movie to Citizen Kane. Though maybe I should. Anyways, so whatever's going on with us gamers, it's pathological. This need to rank games. We get something from the conversation, something important. Interestingly though, it's not self-importance. I don't believe we have this conversation to legitimize games as an art form. Point to the best game and say, see, we are valid, which is sometimes a powerful motivator within games discourse. Our best of all times list are not read by or shown to outsiders. They do not have potent rhetorical power to sway the minds of the masses. No, they're for you, the kind of person who would click on a multi-hour Ocarina of Time review, and somehow sit through it long enough to get to this point. No need to look at that progress bar, the video will be over soon. The Occam's razor answer is we keep having this conversation because it gets clicks. And because it gets clicks, it generates revenue. So publishers are incentivized to make them. But it has to get clicks for a reason. And that reason is because people are invested in the answer to the question, what is the greatest video game of all time? Why do you think people care so much about it? Sound off in the comments below. As for me, I have one cynical and one optimistic explanation for you. Cynically, I feel the debate is an extension of the consumerist impulse of gamers everywhere. Video games discourse has always been strongly influenced by commercial interests. For decades, we rated games on a scale of 1 to 10, not as an artistic exercise in evaluating art, but to determine whether a game was worth the high price of admission. I suppose, by that measure, Ocarina of Time, as Metacritic's highest rated game ever, is the game most worthy to be purchased. So if we already constructed how we talk about games on deciding if they are worth the cash and then numerically judging them for it, the natural end of that conversation is to compare all games against each other. It's a kind of Randian impulse. In the free market of video games, the best will rise to the top, sell the most copies, and live on forever as the best game of all time. Like I said, it's a pretty cynical way of assessing why we keep having the conversation. Though, you gotta admit, it's pretty compelling. But this wouldn't be an I am error video if I just threw an egg on the face of 40 years of gaming discourse and called it a day. No, because it's kind of beautiful, isn't it? The need to discuss the best game of all time also means diving into our medium's history, attempting to parse what games matter most, both for the individual and the collective. It's an earnest endeavor much of the time, one which asks the individual to explain what they value in games and define which games best exemplify those values. To me, the question, what is the best video game, does not actually prompt its answerer to determine which game is better than all other video games. If that was the case, the answer is actually pretty simple. The last big AAA video game. When this video drops, that game will be Tears of the Kingdom. As of the time of this recording, I have not played the new Zelda, in fact it's not even out. But I can guarantee you it's a better, more fully realized and deep game than Breath of the Wild, Ocarina of Time, or pretty much anything else. Not because it's so naturally great, but because games get better all the time. Designers learn new lessons from past mistakes and improve on what came before. It's one of the beautiful things about games. You know the line. Video games have come a long way since Pac-Man, since Super Mario Bros., since Ocarina of Time, since, well, you get the point. So, the pesky question, what is the greatest game of all time, doesn't tell us what the best game is. No, it identifies the most video gamey video game. Those making such lists have some idea in their head as to what video games are, and they select whatever game most closely approximates their definition and label it as the greatest video game. Isn't that beautiful? After all, games are a notoriously difficult medium to define. What do Tetris, Doom, Baba Is You, Outer Wilds, and Celeste have in common? At least far less similarities than in any 5 movies you could find. Video games are a shifting chimera of meaning. We could ceaselessly attempt to determine the greatest among them, not because we care to find a champion amongst the rabble, but because we hope that we can find one game that best exemplifies why we play games, why we fell in love with this art form in the first place. So, if Ocarina of Time is or was that game, which it certainly is by nearly every metric, then perhaps it's just the most video gamey video game. Like I said, it's mayonnaise. It's boring, sure, but a little sweet, a little savory, a little tangy, a little sour, a little salty, a little intense, a little mellow. It's everything and nothing. And that's why we love it, why we love to crown it. So, the next time you see someone enthroning a new greatest game of all time, don't disparage or sigh, but consider, what can I tell about how these people see games from their choices? And I promise you, your resulting thoughts will be far more interesting than a cynical attempt to translate product review scores into a list could ever be. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was the best game I ever played when I was 10 years old. You may recall that in the previous installment of this series, I claimed Super Mario 64 was the best game I ever played when I was 6. But the good times are over. We're kicking Mario to the curb. Before we dive into Ocarina, let's give a quick eulogy for his game. Mario's first foray into 3 dimensions was a wonderful surprise for me at 6 years old. It was the first game that didn't feel like a toy, but a piece of art. It set me on the eventual path to making multi-hour reviews of video games. That said, Super Mario 64 is not without its limitations. By the time I turned 8, I wanted to throw off the shackles of youth. I was almost a preteen. By the time I was 10, I did all the laundry for my family, hauled in wood on frigid winter days for our fireplace, and did our dishes while listening to the Backstreet Boys on my portable CD player. I aspired to be an adult, and Super Mario 64, a game which embraces a childlike sense of play, faded from my prepubescent mind. I liked Mario, but I wanted a game that reflected my new aspirations as a child looking toward adulthood, and lo and behold, a new 3D Zelda game was waiting for me. I loved Ocarina of Time like a dog loves its owner's newborn child. While the game is far too often cited as the greatest video game of all time, I didn't know that when I first played it. I wasn't influenced by reviewer scores or internet conversations, though I was influenced by experience. Before I even heard of the Nintendo 64, I had a Game Boy, and one of the first 3 games I ever owned was The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. My mom bought Link's Tropical Adventure because the original Zelda was my uncle's favorite game 10 years prior when she was in high school. So, let's take a moment to shout her out. Good pick, Mom! I loved Link's Awakening. It was the first game in which I swung a virtual sword, though to be fair, I had swung a club in Bonk's Adventure. Link's Broken Slumber was the first game I tried to read the text of. Sorry, Professor Oak, I clicked A through everything you had to say. Probably why I entered the Elite Four with a level 80 Blastoise while the rest of my squad was under level 40. Like Ocarina of Time, I did not beat Link's Awakening until I was in my 30s, because I first played it when I was 7 years old and didn't have a strategy guide. Nonetheless, it was a formative experience for me, and when I learned that 3D Zelda was coming to the Nintendo 64, I knew I had to check it out. One teensy problem. I did not have a Nintendo 64. If you'll recall from the Mario 64 review, I was only able to play the console when I visited my grandma. Usually every other week, we spent the weekend with my dad, and only on my cousin's Nintendo 64 if they were gracious enough to bring it over. My grandma lived a 3-hour car drive from my home. I only visited so often because my parents were divorced, and that's where my dad took us on his weekends. So, as opposed to Link's Awakening, which I could play whenever I wanted on my beat-up brick of a Game Boy, my chances to play Ocarina of Time were few and far between. But, hoo boy, did they make an impression. I played the game so much, my cousins, who didn't have really an interest in video games, permanently parked the Nintendo 64 at my grandma's house when I came over. Still, my haphazard play schedule meant I never got too far into the game, and I was certainly not helped by the multiple times my save file was deleted and I started all over again. At least one time was the result of my younger brother's malice. I come to you today, 23 years later, to say I forgive him for that. Though I'm not blameless. I sometimes restart the game on my own volition because I couldn't remember what happened last time I played the game. It's surprisingly easy to get lost in a sprawling adventure game when you only play for 2 to 4 hours every couple of weeks, if you're lucky. In fact, in a bit of useful irony, whose purpose we'll get into in the next chapter of this video, as a child, I never escaped the child section of the game. It's as if the universe conspired against me. Here was the best game I ever played, one which represented growing up at a time I wanted to be an adult. And yet, all I knew of it was the prologue where you play as a child. I must have beat the Deku Tree a dozen times, made Darunia dance like a fool on 6 or 7 occasions, and fed Jabu Jabu enough fish to fill his whole belly. Maybe the game theorists should make a video on that. That's so stupid. I was so comfortable with every step of Young Link's journey, I could have literally mapped out Hyrule Castle's stealth sequence before I figured out fractions. So yeah, Ocarina of Time was the best game I ever played, not in spite of having to repeat its early sections so often, but because those sections were so spectacular. You might remember we started our review of Super Mario 64 with a similar observation, noting that its vertical slice was distinctly appealing to a 6-year-old. And while it would be nice to throw off cutting board metaphors for Ocarina of Time, let's hold on to them for just a moment. Zelda games have a similar repetition they rely on for the player. You start in an area beset by some problem, you equip yourself to deal with that problem, dive into a dungeon filled with enemies and puzzles, topple a boss, and resolve the narrative tension created by that initial problem. So in general, we see a setup, the pre-dungeon adventure, the dungeon itself, and resolution. We can draw a straight line from Link's Awakening and Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time. All employ the same repeating structure. So what makes Ocarina of Time special in this regard is not the form itself, but how and where it's implemented, as it's far more narratively dense and of course represented in 3 dimensions. Unlike Super Mario 64, which carried the spirit of its predecessors into a new era, but not their literal structure, Ocarina of Time is an extension of the Zelda formula, as previously established, through and through. Structurally, the game has more in common with Link to the Past than Majora's Mask. In both games, Link adventures through 2 worlds layered on top of each other. In both, he relatively linearly explores a series of dungeons, each getting him closer to his end goal. And narratively,
Both show the player what the world will look like should they fail. The Ocarina of Time Link to the Past connection isn't particularly novel. It's clear that Miyamoto and Nintendo built off of what already worked. But from the perspective of a 10-year-old, you know, me, the similarities made a world of difference. When I first played Ocarina of Time, 3D was fresh, but no longer brand new. I'd already spent many hours in Princess Peach's castle, raced my cousins on go-karts through the desert, fought aliens in a jet as a space animal, and laid thousands of proximity mines to blow up my family as a spy. But none of these fantastic Nintendo 64 games compared to the fantasy of Ocarina of Time. Outside Super Mario 64, they were relatively one-note experiences. They presented singular levels, the potential of 3D segmented into chunks, described as missions or maps, but not actual spaces one could exist in and explore. In most, one was not permitted to go off the rails. Ocarina of Time's developers forsook reinventing the wheel, finding a new way to present the open-world Zelda experience for a single development cycle to perfect and expand on the execution of what came before it, to focus on building an interesting world and making sure playing in that world, in 3 dimensions, proved fun. Their decision hooked me. So much of Ocarina of Time's gameplay was already imprinted upon me from Link's Awakening. I knew the Deku Tree would hold some treasure like the slingshot, which would let me solve puzzles to advance further into its depths. I saw all the bombs lying around Death Mountain and immediately understood I'd be picking them up in no time. I saw Ganondorf through the window at Princess Zelda's castle and instinctively felt in my bones that this bad dude was going to be a thorn in my side for however many hours it took me to beat the game. Though I probably didn't think it would take 24 years worth of hours to get there. Ocarina of Time leans hard on its franchise history as a shorthand for the player. The foregrounding from previous Zelda titles allowed me to experience what was new from Ocarina of Time with sincerity and richness. What seems so simple now, like breaking the Deku Tree's central webbing by jumping from a high height, was novel and would have never come naturally if I was simultaneously trying to figure out what to do with the game's compass or map and piece together where to go next. For Nintendo, Ocarina of Time could have been the natural point for Zelda to turn to a different structure, like how we could compare Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild today. The 3 mainline console games before Ocarina were similar, to be sure, but each had a distinct flavor. So it's somewhat surprising that the leap from Zelda 1 to Zelda 2 was, in some ways, bigger than the leap from 2 to 3 dimensions. But perhaps it shows just how solid Link to the Past's underlying strengths are. One could adhere to them in an entirely different mode of graphical expression and still come out with a damn good game. That said, I don't want to undersell the newness of Ocarina of Time. It was the best game I ever played at the tender age of 8, 9, and 10, not just because it was a 3-dimensional slice of something familiar, but because it was the personification of new car smell in gaming form. I'm sure someone out there has already spent like 2 hours going over every little innovation Ocarina of Time pioneered, so let's just hit up some of the highlights. Z-targeting is a genius solution to the problem of aim in a 3D game, and if you don't believe me, realize you do it instinctively in every single Soulsborne Sekiro Ring game. Navi, despite going on 3 decades as the most despised Zelda character, is brilliant invention to solve the problem of the player getting confused on where to go next. And honestly, I think Tears of the Kingdom should have a Navi. I'm just putting that one out there. Ocarina of Time mastered the use of the context button so well, I'm pretty sure nobody's meaningfully innovated on it since. You know what? Actually, I think we backslid. Ocarina of Time tells you what pressing the button will do, which you can't always say for some games. You know who you are. In my Mario 64 review, I praised the game for its hindsight-appearing foresights. But there's a reason we're still playing and enjoying clones of Ocarina of Time today. and that's because it was so packed with ideas, even it didn't know what to do with them. Which is why I get a little miffed when people call Ocarina of Time overrated. Now, I get it, probably more than you do, would-be naysayer. Ocarina of Time's claim to the throne of greatest game of all time is overbearing and frankly stupid. We all know the greatest game of all time is E.T. Playing the Contrarian is fun, and considering Ocarina isn't even the best Zelda game on the Nintendo 64, it's an easy target for complaint. But also, what are you on about? Dark Souls is just Ocarina of Time with a different marinade. God of War 2018 is just Ocarina of Time with a bald guy. Genshin Impact is just Ocarina of Time with a vending machine jammed inside of it. Good luck finding a post-Y2K 3D action-adventure game that doesn't lift some of its core design principles from Ocarina. Was it necessarily the first to do each of its innovations? No, but it certainly popularized a lot of them. So let's pause for a moment, and if you've ever called Ocarina of Time overrated, say to this digitized representation of its North American box art an apology. If you have never chafed at Ocarina of Time's praise, you may say, "Thank you, Ocarina of Time, for everything." Anyway, let's be honest. Ocarina of Time kinda sucks. Gaming pioneers are usually janky and weird, and this Zelda game is no exception. Link's movement is clunky. 2/3 of the time you have to choose the trade-off between accuracy and actually moving. Like Mario 64, kids these days don't want to play games with such arcane movement systems and weird cameras. Ocarina of Time's hitboxes are whack, and it's easy to get hit by attacks that shouldn't get you, or to miss attacks that should have hit. Also, whoever decided that the first-person aiming should have inverted controls and no option to change it was a monster. I will not comment on whether or not they still are a monster though. Throwing bombs accurately feels more like pulling a lever on a slot machine than playing a video game. Way too often do you do exactly what the game wants and it punishes you for it. And holy moly, I am in my 30s and I can't figure out how to beat Shadow Link without cheesing him with the hammer. Okay, that last one is on me. You see, it's easy and fun to write and talk about these little things, but none of them, from reasons Ocarina of Time is so massively influential to reasons it feels a little rough and dated decades later, speak to why it mattered to me and so many other people. Ocarina of Time is not a perfect video game, but it was the perfect video game for me. It didn't stand out specifically because it had Z-targeting, cinematic cutscenes, or 3D graphics, but because it felt, and still feels like, an adventure. A real classic adventure, like the kind you'd find in a Pulp Fiction novel or a pretty good Lord of the Rings knockoff. I suppose Super Mario 64 is an adventure in the most literal sense, but it doesn't feel like one when you actually sit down to play. It feels like a series of interesting challenges collated together as a haphazard jumble of ideas. Ocarina of Time, on the other hand, feels like a journey, one with mystery, intrigue, and importantly, direction. From the music to the aesthetic to the narrative to every puzzle in between, it's not just cinematic, but narrative driven. You, the player, have a critical role in the game's story and only progress by acting out the correct actions. Games before it had direction, like Final Fantasy VII, but rarely were their narratives so signposted and synthesized with their gameplay. Ocarina of Time is filled to the brim with beginnings, middles, and ends. For example, when you drop a fish in front of a hungry whale and get sucked into his belly Jonah style, you find yourself at the beginning of the dungeon Jabu Jabu's belly, but near the end of the game's Young Link section, but right in the middle of the game's quest to defeat Ganondorf. Perhaps this seems like a dumb observation. Can't you make the same case for when you jump into, Wet Dry World in Super Mario 64? Yes, but no. Sure, you can literally track beginnings, middles, and ends in other games, but how often in those games can the player pinpoint, with considerable accuracy, their current temporal location relative to a variety of in-game narrative events? Not too often. Ocarina of Time foregrounds Link's goals so explicitly. Get these 3 sacred stones, get these 5 sage coins, procure the Master Sword, challenge Ganondorf at his evil Tower of Evil, that it's effortless to determine one's place in the narrative relative to these goalposts and tailor how you should understand your place in the journey. Ocarina of Time is both a grand narrative about conquering evil and a series of episodic stories around Hyrule's various people groups, a sequence of tricky puzzles, and a collage of action segments all rolled into one. The combined effect of all these different scenes gives the player no doubt at any moment that they're on a quest, one with a sordid past, a painful present, and barreling toward an inevitable, if 24 years in the making, conclusion. Ocarina of Time's purposeful continuity astounded pre-teen me. Whereas Super Mario 64 felt like a collection of disparate courses, Zelda showed me a game where not just the challenges, but their pacing was deliberately conceived to narratively flow together. So of course, even in 1998, it reminded me of life. Our lives, despite our memories' attempt to muddy the waters, are lived linearly. You were born and you will die. You once knew something that you have now forgotten. We change. We can't help it. And then we change again. And we couldn't help that either. Memory is a constant reckoning of our own change. We plot out the course of our life in retrospect and take all these events stuck inside our heads and try to make them congruent with some narrative, some story that satisfies us. Though, I don't know about you, but I've never been satisfied with my story, which is probably why I was so in love with Link's. It felt complete. From Ocarina of Time's opening monologue to final credits, we know Link is a product and vessel of destiny. We know this giant world of Hyrule was not only fascinating, but built to lead somewhere amazing, somewhere rewarding, which I couldn't say for my own life. Maybe you can say it for yours. Despite my wonderful privilege to play Ocarina of Time living in a lower middle class family in rural Wisconsin, I was a miserable child. I had a difficult time making friends. My parents were divorced. I was deathly afraid of my stepfather. I spent almost all my time alone. I alternated between bullying other children or being bullied by them. And I was clinically depressed, or at least that's what the doctor said. I have always felt, since I was 5 years old, that every single bit of harm that ever befell me was my own fault. In 1996, the neighborhood children threw a talent show. I mostly remember somebody mooned the crowd. I did not produce talent for the event, but with my mom's permission, I got out all my dad's Surge and gave it to the other children. Probably not good for their teeth. When my dad got home and found no soda waiting for him, he was upset, and not about the cavities. I don't know why I sugarcoat it with humor. He flew into a rage. I was afraid of him. The very next day, my mom left my dad. I blamed myself for the next 10 years. I've always blamed myself for everything, felt the entire weight of the world on me at all times. It's incredibly annoying to the people who love me, and because of it, I've hurt myself and many others. It's also all the emotions I projected onto Link when I was 8. Link is not the cause of Hyrule's maladies, but nonetheless bears the burden for their retrieval. That weight, constantly communicated to the player through their companion Navi, and visibly through the terrible fate of Hyrule 7 years in the future, was familiar to me the first time I played Ocarina of Time. I was a lonely child like Link. I felt the weight of the world crushing my bones to dust. I worried I wasn't good enough. I wondered if I would survive all the pressure I felt. In young Link, I found a kindred spirit, a child with total responsibility and a total lack of ability to do anything about it. Perhaps I never left the young Link phase of the game as a young Evelyn because the idea that I could do something about it someday, if I gave myself the time to mature, scared me. Ironically, my biggest relief from this misery was the place I confronted it when switching on the Nintendo 64. My grandmother's house. By
far, the most important person in my youth was my grandma. And the most important location for me was her home. I resided with, nor in, either. My grandma lived in the middle of nowhere, on a hill miles away from the nearest town, in a huge building which once housed her, my grandpa, and their 5 children comfortably. By the time I was in the picture, my grandma lived by herself. She had over a dozen grandchildren. 10 of us were born within a 2-year window. Of that cohort, I was the oldest. All her grandchildren, save my dad's kids, lived in or around the same small town of 4,000 people, within even just a couple miles. We are well known there, though I am not. Unless my cousin really did brag about the smart cousin who lives far away as often as he said he did. In one of the 3 bathrooms in my grandma's house, she hung a framed embroidery which read, "If I knew grandchildren were so much fun, I would have had them first." And the sentiment perfectly fits my grandma's personality. She poured herself into her grandkids, and I was incredibly lucky to be one of them. She treated me with love and kindness, as she did all of us. Though I felt a special connection to her because she adopted my dad and my dad adopted me. So it felt like I belonged, like I was part of a chain of love stretching back generations. I didn't understand it at the time, but my grandma was also my best friend, and the only person in the world who really made me feel loved. Though, to be clear, I think she had that effect on people. She was everybody's best friend. My grandma's property was not nearly as impressive as the size of her family and her heart, but it was still magnificent. While she would later sell most of it to the Amish, she had miles of land in each direction. As a child, I was free to explore and get lost in those acres, grow familiar with their topography, and adventure out on my own. A quick story. One time I ventured into the woods with the neighbor boy. After questing, we emerged into a large field. On the other side, perhaps 3/4 of a mile away, we saw a black bear. Once we reckoned with what we saw, we ran as fast as we could back to the safety of my grandma's house and spent the afternoon in the basement playing Kirby 64. Though, now that I think about it, I think we probably just convinced ourselves it was a black bear because that would have been a fun story. We did that all the time. The forests and fields and farms of rural Wisconsin were the setting to our imagination. They were anywhere and everywhere we wanted to go. They housed anyone and everyone we wanted to be. They and their matron were everything to me. By the time I played Ocarina of Time, I already had years of experience exploring my own personal wilds. So much so that the Kokiri Forest was not just the setting for the best game I ever played, but evoked a nascent nostalgia of my grandma's forests I had come to know and love. Now knowing those forests, finding them so familiar so as to verge on boring, Ocarina of Time gave me my first nostalgia, and I played it in the place I felt that nostalgia for. When you're a child, your fantasies are wild, creative, and exceptionally dull. You run through the forest, reenact scenes from the kangaroo kung fu flick Warriors of Virtue, and argue who is the warrior of wood and who is the warrior of metal. You, me, claim to want to be the warrior of wind. This annoys your cousins, because such a warrior does not exist in the fiction of the film. But perhaps, in your mind, being trans makes you want to paint outside the box to find yourself. Still, our wonderful play sessions were never more than cosplaying some video game or television characters we liked, so our stories always ended before they began. Ocarina of Time was no such story. It was grand in the same way I remembered Star Wars, or in a few years would experience Fellowship of the Ring. It was substantive enough to activate the part of my soul that wanted, needed an escape from my everyday life. It was a place to get lost and to find oneself, just like my grandma's little abode in the countryside. So, how could Ocarina of Time not be the best game I ever played when I was 8, 9, and 10?
Not only was it, Ocarina of Time, but it perfectly tapped into my own pre-baked nostalgia for a childlike adventure, for Link's awakening, for my home away from home. It reflected my inner turmoil, a hero burdened with guilt, the uncertainty of the future, the ostracized feeling of being different than everyone else. Ocarina of Time was both a game I played at my grandma's home and the game that represented it in my imagination. For one 9-year-old girl in the late 90s, it was the real everything everywhere all at once. And nothing came close. We sometimes like to imagine we enjoy games for objective reasons, that we can explain every bit of game design ingenuity and justify our love. But love doesn't come from outside yourself. It comes from within. I loved Ocarina of Time because it reminded me of home, literally and figuratively. And that's why it was the best game I ever played at that tender age. If Ocarina of Time was that holy place, my grandma was the Deku Tree. Like Link's arboreal quest giver, my grandma gave me purpose and direction. She taught me how to love other human beings, even when they hurt you. Once, when it was time to head back to my mom's house 3 hours away, I began to weep and yell. I didn't want to go. I only today realized I was having a panic attack. My grandma pulled me aside and asked what was wrong. In truth, I couldn't stand life without her. I knew going back to my stepdad's and my school life was a torment I couldn't bear, but I couldn't tell my grandma that. So I lied. I told her the kids at school made fun of me for my last name. She was confused and asked me to explain, but I couldn't. It didn't matter. She gave me a hug and told me it's okay to hurt. My grandma showed me there was more to life than yourself, that you could live with and for others. And even though you couldn't control their actions, you could be proud of the effort you put into them. At the time, I may have wished or imagined myself to be near my own personal fight with Ganondorf. But sooner or later, we all realized our childhood was just a prelude, just a tutorial, like the Deku Tree. Leading up to my grandma's front door was a long cement walkway up on a hill. It had 2 90-degree turns. On one rests a large square slab of cement. Our whole family was there the day they filled it in. My grandma's grandchildren put their initials on it. I think we might have put our handprints in it. We marked that slab of man-made rock and the entire surrounding area as important as ours. My family still talks about that slab of cement in our group chat. They argue whether or not we should pay to have it removed so that we can have it, or if it's better to leave it there as a monument to our memories. It was on that slab of rock my dad first showed me the Big Dipper and all the other constellations. It was near that slab of rock I celebrated every 4th of July for the first 10 years of my life. It was about 50 feet from that slab of rock I played Ocarina of Time for the first time. For the first dozen years of my life, my proximity to that slab of rock was also my proximity to joy. But despite the resilience of cement to extreme weather and overgrowth, it cannot contend with the passage of time. My grandma sold her home when I was 13. It was too big for her to take care of, and she was a widow living on Social Security and needed money. As we cleared away all our stuff, and she did have a lot of stuff, I cried and I cried. I felt so empty. I swore to her one day I'd be a lawyer or a doctor or someone important, and I would buy the house back for her. I promised her I would maintain our family's legacy at that location. I meant it in the most serious way a child can. But time is cruel. I never became a lawyer or a doctor, and if I did, I can't go back to that place. For research purposes, I looked it up, toured through it. There's a bunch of terrible pictures in the various rooms, and I cried. I had an anxiety attack. I can't return. Not with my body, though I return at least a couple times a week when I dream of that house, of the forest around it, of the willow tree and pond at the bottom of her hill. I will never leave up here, because like roots to a tree, they are part of me. Ocarina of Time is a ground-penetrating radar. It maps these emotions and locations for me, reminds me where I come from. My grandma died a few years ago, but Alzheimer's took her senses far before that. Even in high school, when my dad no longer picked us up every other weekend, I still visited my grandma. Once I had a driver's license, I would journey the 3.5 hours to see her and spend multiple weeks each summer with her, getting groceries, listening to old country music, cooking, telling stories, playing guitar, watching game shows. Each one was just as special as any memory formed in that old house, because it was never the house that mattered, was it? It was her. I'm ashamed to admit I was not a good grandchild in her later years, as Alzheimer's took from her what some other illness will one day take from me. I abandoned her. I spent years in a place literally on the other side of the world and became estranged from my many aunts and uncles and cousins. After all, I was always and will always be the cousin who doesn't live here. The girl without a fairy, so to speak. The day before my grandma died, I drove up to visit her. She was unconscious and dying when I got to her. I've always had words. I talk too much, as you can probably tell. But that day, my words failed me. I could only muster holding her hand, an endless stream of tears, and a single sentence I won't utter here. At her funeral, I gave a eulogy. I said words. I tried to explain what she meant to me and everyone who knew her. I don't know if I did a good job. I don't feel like I did, but a lot of people cried, and they told me I did. At the end of my speech, I said I hoped I could someday make someone feel half as welcome and loved as she made me feel. I'm still trying, Grandma. I promise, I'm still trying. As a child, I never finished Ocarina of Time. The physical distance between me and the golden copy of a game I didn't even own proved to be too much. For full transparency, because I've insinuated a few times already that I only played the child sections as a child, I did get to the Forest Temple as a 10-year-old. Though, that was the last time I played the best game I ever played before I could legally call myself a teenager. Do you know what else happened when I was 10 years old? The GameCube came out. And to my surprise, my mom got me and my brother one for Christmas. Thanks, Mom. The first 3 games I had for that wonderful machine were SSX Tricky, Pikmin, and Super Smash Bros. Melee. With my first home console ever parked inside my home, the world of video games opened up to me in ways I could have never imagined just a year or two prior. Think of it a little like the difference between going to see a movie in the theaters and having a television in your room you can watch those same flicks on. For the first 10 years of my life, I could only experience the richness of console video gaming on a 30-year-old CRT in my grandma's basement for a couple hours every other weekend. Playing them was an event, something I did far away from my normal life. After getting a GameCube, console gaming took an air of mundanity. I did it after school and on normal weekends. Most importantly, the Nintendo 64, site of many of my most formative gaming experiences, grew smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. After all, you can bet your life I used that silly handle and brought my GameCube with me to my grandma's house to play with all my cousins. We particularly liked Time Splitters too. Ocarina of Time lost its potency, the hot new thing supplanting it for good. I failed to complete Ocarina of Time for 3 relatively superficial reasons. First, As previously noted, I had to restart the game quite a few times, both because I forgot where I was and what I was doing in the game, and because conniving and/or ignorant family members deleted my save file. I don't blame them, it wasn't even my cartridge. Second, the game was too difficult. I played Ocarina with no strategy guides or help or even Nintendo Power magazines. Usually by myself, in a dark basement, for a couple hours on a groggy Saturday morning before the rest of my family woke up. If some aspect of its design stumped me, I lost a day of play and would need to wait 2 whole weeks before I could attempt to solve it again. Ocarina is not a particularly difficult game, but as a child, it was the most complicated piece of entertainment I'd ever engaged with. These 2 reasons pale in comparison to the third superficial reason I never beat Ocarina. My cousin spoiled the game. He's around 7 years older than me and was the embodiment of cool when I was a kid. He had a girlfriend and had a job. He was adult-like in the way older children seem to younger children. He installed a police scanner in his car, which I'm pretty sure is illegal, and would speed down our rural country roads, confident he'd never be caught by the pigs. In his room, he'd let me watch the first Resident Evil movie, where I first witnessed someone get sliced to small bricks by gridded lasers, and have since harbored a lifelong fear of sterile hallways and lasers. He also let me spend an afternoon in his room watching The Animatrix, which is probably the source of my lifelong fear of robots. Man, he really introduced me to a lot of scary stuff. Most importantly though, he was a big gamer. He had everything: Genesis, PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, and even a Dreamcast. One afternoon, he came over to my grandma's house, and in the sacred basement, housing the Nintendo 64 I spent my childhood on, plopped in his copy of Ocarina of Time, and booted up a save on the brink of defeating Ganondorf. Presumably, this was not the first time he reached the tyrant. He handed me the controller and asked, "You wanna go?" I did. I played hot potato with Ganondorf with the same skill I gained from never playing catch with my dad. I mostly remember falling off the ledge and climbing back again and again. So eventually, Ganondorf killed me. My cousin laughed and said, "Here, let me show you how it's done." Then I spent the next 20, maybe 30 minutes watching him finish the best game I ever played as a child. As his Link's sword pierced Ganon's skull, so too did my desire to defeat Ocarina of Time at all. The jig was up, the song was played, I knew how it all ended. So even if I hadn't gotten a GameCube shortly before or after this life event, my time with Ocarina was cooked. Did I regret not finishing Ocarina of Time? Yes and no. I wanted to be someone who finished the game, and in most conversations for the past 20 years, I've insinuated I did. In reality, I beat Ocarina in the same way I beat Final Fantasy VII, as in, I watched someone else do it. It's okay to enjoy spectating video games, but if you watch a Super Metroid Let's Play, you didn't complete it, did you? Sure, as I noted in the last elaborate review, I never finished Super Mario 64 either, but whereas I always knew exactly what would happen if I did, Ocarina of Time was a journey, a linear narrative experience, not an open sandbox like Mario. You never meaningfully complete a sandbox. See the Super Mario 64 review for more on that. But Zelda, you can finish Zelda. So I couldn't escape the feeling I let it slip through my fingers. But I also had no regrets about my time with the game. What was I supposed to do? Play an hour or two of Ocarina every other weekend? Even if we accept, erroneously, that 9-year-old me could somehow hit the average how long to beat time of 26 hours, playing at that rate would have taken me a full year of weekends. I was never going to finish Ocarina of Time under the conditions I experienced it, and that's okay. Ocarina is a game I loved, one which inspired my love for video games, but it's also one I never beat. Each of these things can be true. Finishing a game is not a prerequisite to experiencing one. So let's consider a question. Just how important is it to complete a video game? It's kind of hard to say. On one hand, the question is inherently insulting. Most people would say reading a book entails reaching the last page, and that you haven't actually seen the Mario movie if you got kicked out of the Alamo Drafthouse 30 minutes into the screening for looking at your phone. The subtext of the verbs read and watched implies you finished them. So how can we have played a video game without playing all of it? Perhaps because games are more like television shows. In the era of streaming, most TV shows are just 10-hour movies now, but in the before times, if you had a student-teacher conference on a Monday night, you could kiss that week's episode of The Black Donnellys goodbye. And then it was canceled before it reached its first season and never reached syndication, but that doesn't mean I haven't seen it. Television's just different. Most would say you've watched Monty Python's Flying Circus, even if it was just a couple episodes when you were sick with chickenpox and stuck at home with your mom for a week. Okay. Enough suspiciously specific memories from my childhood. Are games more like movies or TV? If we go by continuity, they're more like films, right? A game might have chapters or levels, but we always discuss them as a whole piece of art. We tend not to discreetly take out one thing when assessing them. While we might dissect Ocarina's tedious water temple or bizarre mask side quest, the air around these discussions sounds more like pulling out themes than describing full episodes. Yet if we go by abject length, games are more like television. Rare is the AAA video game you could complete in one sitting like a movie, but a season of The Office is 8 hours long, and Grey's Anatomy tops out at 16 hours of content to watch each season. You could watch them all in one sitting, but we call that binging because it's not the intended way to experience these kinds of shows. In terms of length, Ocarina of Time is a lot closer to Law & Order, the TV show, than Law & Order, the 6 films that happen to share that name. Though, unlike TV, you can't miss part of a video game. Ocarina of Time, for instance, must be completed sequentially. You can't experience its episodes out of order. Good luck getting the mirror shield before the boomerang, for instance. So, we're kind of talking in circles now. I think this is why people become enamored with terms like vertical slice or gameplay loop. They give us an opportunity, however slim, to turn games into little episodes we can describe without requiring their completion. Yet, completing the Deku Tree, Ocarina's first true vertical slice, is not the same thing as beating the game. Vertical slice and gameplay loop are mostly terms for designers, which allow them to break a game into more manageable chunks to work on. If you feel yourself in a gameplay loop while you're playing a game, you're probably not playing a good one. Sidebar. Okay, yeah, in the last elaborate review, I talked at length about Mario 64's vertical slices, but if you paid attention, I was actually making fun of the term. Most of the time people use the term gameplay loop in a video, I actually cringe a little bit. It makes us video essayists sound smarter for sure, but most of the time explaining a gameplay loop does nothing to dissect the meaning or quality of a game. Okay, geez, I'm having a hard time staying on topic. Focus, Evie, focus. What I actually want to do is give an impassioned defense of not finishing games. That's right, as my father-in-law would say, I've fallen off one side of the horse, and that side is not finishing games. I am a serial incompleter. Going back, it'd almost be easier to write about the games I have completed, more so than the ones I haven't. Let's just take the GameCube, my first home console. I compiled a list of every GameCube game I either owned or rented/borrowed for a significant period of time. Excluding games like Animal Crossing and Melee, which can't be meaningfully beaten, I finished a whopping 1 out of 12. And that was Pikmin, which I'm pretty sure I got the bad ending for. Does that even count? Oh my god. So maybe I have a little bit of a problem. It wasn't just Ocarina of Time. I bet you didn't see that coming, because honestly, I didn't see it coming. Okay. So I sincerely do think it's okay not to finish games because you've only got so much time in your life, and if you aren't enjoying a game, just go do something else. That's okay, that's natural. That was originally going to be the whole point of this section, but do I have a problem? Yes, I do. I've gotten better in recent years, I swear, but looking back at my childhood, I was terrified of finishing games, and I think I know why. Let's play back the tape. Sorry, Professor Oak, I clicked A through everything you had to say.
Probably why I entered the Elite Four with a level 80 Blastoise while the rest of my squad was under level 40. Yeah, what I forgot to mention is that after I beat the Elite Four, I cried. They weren't happy tears either. They were miserable, sad ones. I couldn't start over. I loved my Blastoise too much. But in my mind, there was nothing left to do. The game was over. Blastoise might as well have been dead, even if I kept him alive for 7 years until the cartridge battery died like a zombie. Pokemon Red was the first game I ever beat, and for most of my youth, it was the only game I ever beat. I've always had a mental block around finishing games because an unfinished game is still alive, something I can go back to, keep playing if I so desire, while a finished game is dead. You may ask, why can't you just replay games you like, Mrs. I Am Error? I don't know. The same reason I don't rewatch movies? To be honest, I have a weird eidetic memory for games and movies. Okay, it's not literally an eidetic memory, but basically when I try to replay a game I've played in like the last 5 or 10 years, I remember everything that's about to happen with an uncanny like deja vu feeling. It makes the games not very fun and usually incredibly boring. Every moment of the game feels played out. If you've ever had to do some rote task like data entry or dishwashing, it's like that. I'm not joking. It's part of why I sometimes wonder if I kind of straight up don't like games. Though I do, don't worry. I really do like games. To be clear, I'm not joking when I say the more I enjoy a game, the more I push it away. Ultimately, it wasn't snarky cousins defeating Ganon in front of me or game cartridges residing 120 miles from my home that did in my ability to beat Ganondorf. It was my own love for Ocarina of Time. I was scared if I finished the game, it would cease to be an active part of my life, only a distant memory. I felt it with Blastoise. The moment I defeated the Elite Four, my relationship with the gun-toting turtle ended, and he went from active component of my daily routine to a relic, sitting on my shelf, gaining dust. If you'll allow me to psychoanalyze for a moment, my trepidation might make sense. If you'll recall in the last section, when I was 5 years old, my parents divorced, which my adolescent brain always blamed my adolescent actions for. The most significant event of maybe my entire childhood was an ending I believed I caused. How could I not be afraid of completing a video game? Wouldn't I just be reliving the worst 2 days of my life again? Or at least that's how I viewed it. So the closer I got to a game, the more I cared about what happened in it, the more afraid I became of the possibility it might end. What would happen to this relationship? Would it just evaporate? I was a lonely child. I did not have friends. Looking back on it now, my closest friends kind of were the video games I loved. I know it's pathetic, but it's true. By that logic, for a few years, Ocarina of Time wasn't just some video game about a hero saving a princess. It was my best friend outside my grandma. That's why I never got past the child section. My love for the game was so great, the very idea of transitioning to adult Link took on an air of finality my little heart couldn't bear. I didn't want to say goodbye to my friend. I wanted to live in stasis forever. At least if I gradually forgot about it, that wouldn't be nearly as painful as saying goodbye. So that's what I did. I gradually let Ocarina of Time go from game I am playing to game I once played. And in the process, I saved myself from the pain of ending it. I was a child. How could I ever regret an action taken with such desperate self-preservation? But my childhood pain offers us a unique insight, because here's the thing. I may have started Ocarina of Time 24 years ago, but I'm still not out of time. I could still replay it, beat Ganon, complete the journey I started oh so long ago. So that's exactly what I did. That's right, it's been 2 decades, I've already seen the Deku Tree die a dozen times, but this time I could really do it. I could go to the Gerudo Desert that only existed in Nintendo Power in my dreams. I could finally face those creepy hand shadows in the Shadow Temple my cousin warned me about. I could finally beat Ingo in a horse race. And who says I can't? So, on May 9th,
2023 at 8:19 Central Standard Time, 8,874 days after the release of Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64, I started the game for what felt like my 8,874th attempt. But this time, I was determined to finish it, come hell or high water. After all, I did have this elaborate review to write. I absolutely crushed How Long to Beat's average Ocarina player and finished the game in 18 hours. At exactly 11 p.m. on March 13th, I finished watching the credits roll. It happened in a flash in 4 short days, mostly just playing during my toddler's afternoon nap and at night when they went to bed. I captured a memory of Ocarina of Time, beginning to finish, and froze it in time forever. Not to mention I literally recorded it. No longer the iconic game I've never beaten, but one I knew start to end, and it was one of the most surreal and wonderful experiences I've ever had with a video game. I breezed through the child section of the game within just 2 play sessions totaling 3.5 hours. Nothing gave me any trouble. No untimely deaths, no difficult bosses, no puzzling puzzles. I'd lived through this all before, and I was going through the motions. Though every minute that passed, every moment I progressed further into the game, I felt a weight in my chest grow heavier. Eventually, I reached that critical midway point of the game. Zelda tossed me the blue ocarina, and I tepidly made my way to the Temple of Time. I pulled the sword from the stone, invited Ganondorf for tea in the sacred realm, and became an adult. No longer tethered to my childhood memories, the game's puzzles started to throw me for a loop. I got a little lost in the Forest Temple, and I spent way too long putzing around without the red tunic in Death Mountain. The Water Temple was tedious, but not nearly as difficult as I'd been led to believe. The Shadow Temple was where I truly found myself in unknown waters, and its macabre setting surprised and unsettled me. Then I spent way too long in Gerudo's Fortress because I didn't understand how the stealth mechanics were supposed to work. After the Desert Temple, which was quite enjoyable, I made my way to Ganondorf. I'm sad to admit, in my only game over screen of the entire run, I failed to beat the villain on my first try. My cousin was probably laughing somewhere out there. Though, I quickly realized I didn't have the Great Fairy's defense blessing, got it, and promptly stomped him into oblivion. Then came Ganon, who I slew with my golden blade, sealing my fate forever. Ocarina of Time surprised me in a number of ways. I was surprised by how easy it was. Like I said, I only had 1 game over across my entire run, and it was right at the finish line. As a child, I remembered it as terribly difficult. I remembered beating bosses with a half heart remaining, both it and my literal heart audible in my ears. As an adult, I never found Ocarina of Time boring, but it rarely offered exhilarating gameplay. I was surprised by how spiritual the game gets, particularly every time Sheik shows up. Ocarina of Time hits the pause button and just waxes poetically for a few moments. I was surprised by the interplay between young and adult Link in the later sections of the game. I had no clue the Desert Temple had an entire young Link section. If you had asked me that 10 years ago, I would have told you it didn't, and probably bet my life on how sure I was. So, I guess I should be dead. Instead, by the end of the game, I genuinely felt like the hero of time, because my adventures crisscrossed between the past and future often enough to earn that title. But most of all, I was surprised by how much the game meant to me. When I started planning this elaborate review, I genuinely did not believe Ocarina of Time was a particularly important game to me. Initially, I named this season Low-Hanging Fruit because the games were such obvious choices for a video game video essays to cover. Yes, it was the best game I ever played at the tender age of 8, 9, and 10, but I liked other Zelda games more. The original, Link's Awakening, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Wand of Gamelon all meant more to me than Ocarina of Time. I thought I would play the game, have some useful insights about why Navi is a tremendous companion, why the music has an immaculate vibe, and why completing games is never all it's cracked up to be. But instead, I had an experience bordering on the spiritual, because Ocarina of Time allowed me to literally, or at least as close to literally as possible, time travel. And in doing so, let me have a conversation with myself. In Ocarina of Time, you play as a child who slowly grows familiar with their surroundings. The primary verb of the game is explore, and across the game's first few dungeons and in every side quest in between, Link gets a lay of the land and better understands the location and the people that inhabit it. Then the game throws him a curveball, twists and distorts both him and his home. To both survive and save this new Hyrule, Link must saliently remember everything his child self learned and lean onto his old friendships. It's no coincidence that 5 of the 6 sages Link awakens are individuals he met as a child. The point of the entire plot is to generate a sense of continuity between 2 drastically different versions of the same character. What I didn't expect was to find that continuity in myself. When I was child Link, I less played Ocarina of Time and more remembered what it was like to play the game as a child. The Deku Tree in particular was like watching a movie of my own memories. When I was adult Link, I relied heavily on the knowledge of Hyrule I picked up as a 10-year-old, even in areas I never experienced as a child. It was those same intuitions Ocarina of Time taught me 20 years prior that guided me through its challenges. It was as if the ghost of my childhood self sat next to me, giving me pointers, guiding me through a game so formative to my understanding of games themselves. A part of me emerged from all the muck of memory and proudly stated, "I'm here." Somewhere between these lines of code and my recollection of them, I found a version of myself I had long since buried. Honestly, it broke me. I struggled for months to write this review because I don't know how to explain to you how it made me feel. Ocarina of Time did not give me a sense of clarity, but a profound bit of confusion. It was like I was on the shore between the sea of my subconscious and the beach of lived reality, and I spent my entire life feeling they were separate entities, and in a moment they crashed together so thoroughly as to be indistinguishable from each other. I was at once the child playing Ocarina of Time for the first time, and the adult replaying it for the 1000th. Like the main character of the game, I was 2 different people, occupying 2 separate spaces, and 1 person occupying 1 space. The paradox, not a mistake, but the nexus of meaning itself. To be clear, I wasn't experiencing nostalgia for the past, at least not as I understand it. I wasn't romanticizing my grandma's basement or wistfully recollecting some pleasant memory. No, my feelings for the game went much deeper than sentiment. I felt like I saw myself as a person who was once someone and now is someone else. Just as I charted Link's odyssey from child to adult, I mapped my own journey to maturation from a shy child to an old woman. In the vast indifference of time, I felt a great connection of self bind me to my body and remind me that I've always been me, even if the idea of me is ever changing. All these feelings got me thinking about what Ocarina of Time is actually about. I reflected on it with some seriousness and time before coming to a simple forward answer. Your actions become you. In Ocarina of Time, each character is defined by their actions and takes on new titles and names in response to their acts. Ganondorf changes with each evil deed from the King of Thieves to Great King of Evil, and eventually to the simple Ganon. Zelda begins the game as a demure child, a princess, but takes up the alter ego of Sheik when she goes underground to fight Ganondorf's reign of terror, and finally takes up the role of the 7th sage to save the kingdom. Each of the other sages transforms into their role through their own selfless actions and maturation, often inspired by the player's actions to save their people. Link goes through the most drastic changes. At the beginning of the narrative, he's defined not by what he does, but what he hasn't, as he's the boy without the fairy. But from his actions, he becomes a brother to Darunia, fiancé to Rudo, Epona's faithful companion, an adult, and ultimately the hero of time. He is not inherently these things. It is his actions, most potently pulling the Master Sword from a stone, that makes him what he is. Every step of the way, Link is defined not by who he is, after all, he is no one, but by what he does. Each other character follows suit. You and I aren't so different. We aren't the sum collection of our personality traits, what games or music we consume, or even our memories. We are the result of our actions. Who you really are isn't reflected in your idealized version of yourself, but in the yourself that does. Your past and present merge not in your continuous stream of thoughts, but in your continuous stream of actions, because your actions become you. I know this isn't mind-blowing stuff, but what I realized from playing Ocarina of Time is that I haven't ever allowed myself to think about me in these terms. Instead, I've always allowed what happened to me to define who I was. I thought or felt, my parents got divorced, that's who I am. An adult told me I was worthless, so that must be me. I was bullied, so I must have deserved it. I allowed how I thought other people felt about me to define me. Honestly, for 30 years, I don't know if I once looked at my own actions and thought, yep, these are reflective of who I am. I internalized the nastiest things anyone ever told me and accepted them as true. I suppose that was an action, and it did become me in the most twisted sense imaginable. I can point to actions I've taken and see how they've become me. I am a teacher, a consequence of 7 years of educating college students. I am a YouTuber, the natural noun to describe those who upload videos to this platform. I am a foster mother, a deliberate result of actions taken to care for children in my community. But despite constantly changing, just like Link, I worry I'll always be an extension of that child, depressed and underachieving, never reaching out because I only look at myself from the primordial perspective of abusive hate. But if I can beat Ocarina of Time after nearly 25 years of failure, maybe it's not too late to change. Maybe I can see myself not as a collection of tragedies and dead ends. Maybe I can stop hating myself for having the audacity to be born. Maybe I can give myself a break and see myself as I really am and not as I was taught to see myself. I think back on my grandma, and yes, she had a great personality, but it was her actions that moved me. She is gone now, but if she resided in those actions, she lives on in me. And funnily enough, if you take anything from this video, let it impact you in even the smallest way, then she lives on in you too. That brings me much comfort. So, thank you for watching this all the way to the end. As you stretch out into life's endless brevity, please take with you a lesson I learned 24 years too late. Your actions become you. And that's the beautiful thing about being alive. A special thank you to my top patrons, also known as Goofs: Caddies, Eric Hamilton Schneider, Kalis, Lily Noah, Max Remus, Stockhack, and Thea Ware. I love you guys.